Some heroes don't wear medals, they carry silence like a second skin. Harrison Ford hadn't set foot near Arlington in over a decade, but on a morning brushed with wind and memory, he stood at the gates alone, not as a legend, not as a guest, but as a man honoring a promise no one else remembered. What happened next would shake the ceremony and reveal a legacy no one had planned to acknowledge. Before we begin, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, hit subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Arlington doesn't whisper, it holds its breath. Especially on mornings like this, when the sun climbs slow, the flags barely stir, and even the wind seems to wait for permission. Rows of white headstones stretch in perfect formation, each one carved with a name someone still remembers. Today's ceremony was invitation only. Special clearances, gold-trimmed badges, black SUVs with tinted windows. No surprises. That's what the security chief had promised. But then one showed up. He didn't come in a convoy, no escort, no formal coat or medals pinned to his chest. Just a man, older, slower, wearing a leather flight jacket worn smooth at the elbows and a sun-faded cap pulled low over his eyes. His boots, military issue decades ago, moved with a kind of quiet authority that didn't ask for space. It took it. A canvas bag, dusty and creased, hung from his shoulder, like it had been places and never complained. Private Mason noticed him before anyone else. The young soldier stood at the western gate, clipboard tight in hand, headset crackling with final checks. He stepped forward. "Sir, this area is restricted. Guests must be verified before entering." The old man didn't flinch, just adjusted the strap on his bag. Mason frowned. "I'm going to need to see your clearance." No answer, just eyes steady, unreadable. "You're not on the list," Mason said, checking again. "Please step back from the entrance." That's when the man finally spoke. "I fought beside a few names on those headstones today. 7 words, no more, no less, not a protest, not a plea." Mason hesitated. He'd been trained for all kinds of threats, but not this, not someone who didn't challenge, didn't obey, just stood. Across the path, an older woman with a service pin on her lapel slowed her step. She stared at the man, squinting through thick glasses. Something about him made her pause mid-stride. She reached into her purse, pulling out a folded brochure from the Air and Space Museum. On the back page, an archival photo of a flight crew in Vietnam, faded but clear. Second from the left was him. She looked up again. The man hadn't moved, and Mason still didn't know who he was, but Arlington was about to find out. Private Mason checked his watch again. 14 minutes to ceremony start. The western gate wasn't supposed to be busy, just overflow personnel, late-arriving Gold Star families, maybe a few staffers. But this wasn't on the checklist. And Mason liked checklists, he liked rules, they made sense, they gave order, and right now he needed order. His radio buzzed in his ear. "Final sweep complete, lock perimeter in 5. Another reminder to keep things tight. "Keep it clean." Mason looked back at the old man standing just beyond the gate line. Still there, still calm, still wrong. "Sir, I've already told you," Mason said louder this time, stepping in front of him. "This is a closed event. You can't just walk in and expect to stand among the honored guests." The man didn't respond. He just shifted his weight, like someone who'd stood still for a long time and knew how to wait longer. Mason exhaled hard. "You're not listening, are you? This isn't a museum. It's not story hour. You don't get to wander in here because you think you've got something to say." The man adjusted the strap on his canvas bag. That was all. No eye roll, no scoff, no defiance, just stillness, which made it worse. Mason's voice dropped into something colder. "This place is for families, for real veterans, for those who actually served." No answer, not even a blink. Mason's hand tightened around the water bottle in his vest pocket. Condensation slipped down the sides. He pulled it out slowly, unscrewed the cap, and without ceremony, tipped it forward. A steady stream poured out, first onto the man's shoulder, then the top of the canvas bag. Water darkened the leather jacket. It splashed against the faded fabric of the bag, dripping to the pavement in slow, deliberate splats. The man didn't move, didn't step back, just stood as water soaked into his sleeve, then into the worn duffel at his side. Mason let the bottle empty completely, then dropped it to the ground with a hollow plastic thunk. "There," he muttered. "Maybe now you'll understand." Still nothing, just a slow blink, like the man was watching a storm pass that he'd seen too many times before. From a few yards away, a volunteer coordinator glanced up. She had been organizing seat cards, but now her eyes locked onto the scene. She saw Mason's rigid posture, saw the dripping bag, and saw the man soaked, still, silent, her brow furrowed. She didn't speak, just watched. The old man turned without a word. Not a scowl, not a glare, just a quiet pivot, as if he'd been dismissed not by force, but by habit. As he stepped away from the gate, something shifted in the bag. Water had loosened the top flap. With each step, a corner of cloth pulled back. A sliver of bronze caught the light. Not a keychain, not a pin, a medal, military, real, slightly tarnished. Its ribbon was frayed, the edges curled like it had been folded, pressed, packed for years. But unmistakable. The volunteer saw it. Her breath hitched. She reached out instinctively, but the man had already passed. The flap fell back into place, hiding the medal once again. Mason didn't notice. He had already turned back to his clipboard, satisfied, adjusting his vest like he had restored order. But across the field, something had been seen, and it would not be forgotten. 10 years earlier, the mountains of eastern Afghanistan weren't quiet. They cracked and spat fire. The air didn't drift, it screamed. And in the middle of that chaos, a battered Black Hawk dropped below the ridgeline, slicing between jagged peaks with a kind of reckless grace only earned through years, not training. Flying low meant risk. Flying low meant you felt the bullets kiss the hull like angry fingers, but that was the only way in. Harrison Ford had no orders to be there. The request came in through a scrambled line, full of static and urgency. A patrol had gone dark. No air support. Ground forces couldn't breach the terrain in time. He was already in the region on a humanitarian drop. His mission was supposed to be over. He didn't hesitate. The coordinates came with a warning: small arms fire, possible mortars, unknown hostiles. He acknowledged, switched frequencies, and said 5 words to the crew chief. "We're going in, light and fast." Minutes later, he touched down in a ravine barely wide enough for the rotors. Dust whipped into the cockpit, blinding, burning. Through the haze, movement, 3 figures dragging another, one limping badly, one not moving at all. The soldiers scrambled aboard as bullets began stitching the rocks around them. 2 bodies in stretchers, one under his own power. One of them, with blood on his cheek and dirt in his teeth, looked at Harrison through the noise. He didn't speak. Just nodded. It wasn't clean. One of the engines took a hit on takeoff. The bird rattled harder than usual. Harrison had to coax it up and over a ridge with less thrust than he wanted and more weight than they should have carried. But they made it. 43 minutes later, they touched down on the edge of a forward operating base under moonlight. Inside the med tent, the triage team worked fast. One soldier, Private Langley, was gone. Another, Specialist Duran, slipped into a coma by sunrise. The rest, shaken, stitched, breathing. Ford didn't stick around for recognition. He wiped the blood off the yoke, refueled, and prepared to fly out before the next call came. But then someone called his name. He turned. It was the lieutenant, the one with the dirt still in his teeth and the look of someone who had seen more than he could hold. He walked with a limp, one arm bandaged, the other holding a sealed pouch. "I'm Hoyt," he said. Ford just nodded. Hoyt reached into his pouch and pulled out a medal, fresh, clean, recently awarded. "They gave me this last week. I didn't earn it, not yet, but I figured if anyone was gonna keep it safe." He placed it in Ford's hand. Then he added quieter, like a whisper buried under mortar smoke. "If I don't make it someday and there's a memorial, show up. Just stand there. That way somebody'll know I existed." Ford looked at the medal, then at the young man's eyes, then tucked it into the pocket inside his jacket. He never told anyone. He never needed to. 3 years later, Hoyt's name appeared on a casualty list from a crash over Kandahar. A mechanical failure mid-flight. No enemy fire, no survivors. The report was brief. His name was one of many. But Harrison Ford remembered. He remembered the dust, the eyes, the weight of a promise spoken in the middle of noise and chaos. And that medal, it stayed with him. through moves, through years, folded in cloth and placed in a canvas bag like a silent oath. The same medal that now lay soaked from Mason's water, tucked inside a bag no one had bothered to check. Because some promises aren't loud, some don't need reminders, they just need to be kept. Rows of chairs snapped into alignment. Cables were taped, banners adjusted, microphones tested with clockwork urgency. The opening anthem was 10 minutes out, and the event crew was racing against a countdown only they could hear. The guest list had been finalized 3 weeks prior. Each seat bore a name, each name came with a file, no deviations, no unknowns, except one. He stood just beyond the west fence, not in the way, not causing a scene, just present. Still like a stone placed carefully where no one expected it. His leather jacket, still damp from the water, clung to his frame. The canvas bag at his side didn't sway anymore. It simply hung there, heavy with silence. A junior tech, with a camera rig, walked the perimeter, collecting ambient shots. Light played beautifully across the field. She turned her lens west, drawn by instinct more than intention. Framed in golden sunlight, half shadowed by a flag's movement, the old man stood alone. There was something cinematic about it, timeless and quiet. She zoomed in. "Who's that?" she asked over her headset. The producer's voice came sharp. "Don't know, not on our visuals list. Pull that shot, now." She hesitated. "But he..." I said cut him. No unidentified faces go to stream. Final warning. The feed switched. The man vanished from the monitor. But not from the eyes of those who noticed. Near the back row of seating, a pair of veterans shared a glance. One leaned forward, squinting. "You see that guy at the fence?" His friend nodded. "Didn't come in through the checkpoint. I've been watching him stand there for 20 minutes. You think he's lost? No, look how he holds himself, not lost, waiting." A few feet away, a Gold Star mother paused mid-conversation. Her fingers clenched the program in her lap. Something about that profile, his posture, his presence, tugged at a memory she couldn't place. And near the very end of the last row, under the shadow of a memorial tree, an elderly man in an Air Force cap slowly stood. He leaned on a cane with the care of someone who had counted each year he'd been given. His gaze followed the old man by the fence, unblinking. "That's him," he whispered to no one in particular. "That's the one who flew our last flight out of Qanar." A young Marine seated beside him turned. "Sir." The old pilot didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the man in the leather jacket. The air shifted, not loudly, not in any way the cameras could catch, but in the quiet exchanges, the sideways glances, the halted conversations. Someone had arrived, someone who wasn't expected, but now couldn't be ignored. And still he didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood and waited. Inside the command tent, the final prep was unfolding with practiced precision. General Eastman stood in front of a mirror, straightening his ribbons. Aide officers moved like clockwork around him, final seating confirmations, stage cue adjustments, a backup speech loaded onto the teleprompter just in case. Everything was right on time, no deviations, no surprises. Until one came through the comm line. "General, we've got a situation at the West Gate. Unidentified civilian refusing to leave. Minor disruption." Eastman barely looked up. "Handled." "Not yet, sir. He's still there, won't speak, just standing." The general turned, brow furrowed. "You need me for a trespasser." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Sir, I think you should see him for yourself." That was enough. Eastman nodded once, handed his note cards to a junior officer, and stepped out of the tent. The air outside was crisp, the kind that only fell before a formal occasion. Flags shifted gently along the walk. Rows of guests adjusted jackets, heels tapping against the paved path. He moved quickly down the west perimeter, boots clicking over stone. 2 Marines saluted as he passed. A staff sergeant opened the gate for him. And then he saw it. Not the man, not at first. He saw Mason, rigid stance, lips pursed, trying to keep his composure as the older man stood in front of him, soaked, unmoved. Then Eastman saw the eyes and stopped walking. His gaze locked for only a second, but in that second, everything around him went still. "My God," he said under his breath, "that's Ford." He didn't speak to his aide, didn't issue an order. He moved quietly, directly, toward the fence. Mason saw him coming and straightened. "Sir, I already informed the individual." Eastman raised one hand, the kind of gesture that stops more than words. Mason froze. The general stepped up to the old man, close enough to see the water still dripping from his jacket, the crease in his canvas bag, the glint of something metallic barely visible beneath the flap. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. General Eastman extended his hand to the gate lock, turned it, and pulled the section of barrier wide. Then he stood at attention and offered a full military salute. It wasn't showy, it wasn't ceremonial, it was reverent. Harrison Ford gave a faint nod, nothing more. Eastman lowered his hand. His voice, though low, carried weight. "You're the reason we can hold this ceremony at all." Mason looked between them, confused. "Sir, who is he?" Eastman didn't answer him. Instead, he turned back toward the field. "Escort Mr. Ford to the guest circle," he said to a stunned officer nearby. "Front row." The young man blinked. "Yes, sir." Whispers moved like wind across the space. The man no one recognized suddenly had presence. Real presence. Not from power, not from fame, from something else entirely. As Ford walked beside the officer, shoes wet against the pavement, guests turned. A few stood without knowing why. Some simply watched, unsure what they were witnessing. And in the last row, under the memorial tree, the old Air Force pilot lowered his cane and stood without aid. He raised his hand in a salute, shaky but deliberate. The others followed. One by one, not because they were told, because they understood. The man in the leather jacket was no longer a mystery. He was memory, living, breathing, and finally seen. The ceremony resumed, but something had shifted. The seats looked the same. The flags still moved in the breeze. The podium still waited under the canopy, but the air was different now. As Harrison Ford was quietly guided to the front row, a wave moved through the audience. Not noise, not words, just presence. Uniforms straightened, hands settled, conversations stopped mid-thought. Every pair of eyes found him, and for a brief moment, the silence felt earned. General Eastman approached the podium with the weight of someone carrying more than notes. He set his prepared speech aside. No glance at the teleprompter. No nod to the sound crew, just a breath. And then his voice, measured but real. "When we gather like this, we talk about sacrifice, we talk about honor, and sometimes we forget that those words have faces. Not just the ones carved in stone or etched on bronze, but the ones who walk among us, quietly, without asking to be seen." He paused, eyes scanning the rows. "I was given a speech to read today. It listed achievements, numbers, fallen units, flight records. I was supposed to speak for 8 minutes and then make way for the wreath. But I'd like to talk about something else, or rather, someone else." Chairs creaked as guests leaned forward. 10 years ago, during Operation Eastgate, our team faced a logistical wall. A recovery unit had gone dark in the Kunar province. Intel was thin, weather was bad. Command was debating options. We were still inside a safe zone, in a room with coffee and whiteboards. He looked toward the front row, where Ford sat, hands folded, gaze down. But while we were talking, he was already in the air. Murmurs swept the field. No backup, no escort, no official order, just coordinates and the knowledge that if someone didn't go, they wouldn't come back. His voice tightened, not from weakness, but memory. He flew in alone. Pulled 3 men out of a hot zone. 2 of them are here today. 1 of them didn't make it. His name was Lieutenant Hoyt. Several heads bowed. 1 woman in the second row clutched a photo in her lap. I didn't know the full story until later. Most of us didn't, because he never told it. Eastman's gaze returned to the audience. You know what else he didn't tell anyone? That for the last 7 years, he's funded a scholarship in Hoyt's name, not under his own, quietly, anonymously. And last spring, Hoyt's daughter used that scholarship to graduate from flight school. She's now stationed overseas, following in her father's path, because someone kept a promise. Gasps broke the silence like distant thunder, then stillness again. He didn't want that story told, but today isn't about comfort, it's about truth. He turned to Harrison. You showed up when no one asked you to, you stayed when no one noticed, and you gave when no one expected it. Ford didn't respond, just sat still as if the words weren't his to own. Eastman looked back to the crowd. We have medals for valor, ribbons for service, but what do we give to someone who simply chooses to be there, without cameras, without applause, just there? He let the silence stretch, then added, softer now, I suppose we give what we can. Our thanks and our recognition. The audience rose again, not from command, but from something deeper. A pilot, a mother, a cadet. One by one they stood, heads high, eyes forward. No anthem played, no bugle called, just reverence. Ford remained seated, because for men like him, standing isn't always how you show respect. Sometimes staying still means more, and that day every soul on that field understood it. The field had emptied, chairs stacked, flags lowered. The echoes of the ceremony still lingered in the air, soft as dust. No one gave orders anymore. No one moved with urgency. It was the kind of silence that came after something sacred had been said and nothing more needed to follow. Back at the West Gate, Private Mason crouched alone, gathering discarded programs and forgotten coffee cups. No one spoke to him, no one made eye contact. His clipboard was gone, replaced by a weight he didn't know how to carry. He spotted something beside the fence, half hidden under a folding chair, damp and darkened by morning sun, the canvas bag, the same one he'd soaked with water, the same one no one else had touched. He hesitated, then reached for it. It was heavier than it looked. The strap frayed at one end, the leather patch at the bottom stained with years. He opened it slowly, as if expecting it to argue. Inside was a folded cloth, olive green and worn thin. Wrapped within it, a photo. Mason lifted it carefully, the edges curled from age. The image showed a group of young men, dust on their boots, smiles stretched across tired faces. 4 soldiers. One man at the center, older than the rest, standing just slightly back, but unmistakably present. Harrison Ford. Behind them, the battered hull of a helicopter. He flipped the photo over. A line of handwriting, sharp and deliberate, stretched across the back. We made it out because of him. Keep this for us. Hoyt. Mason stared at the words. Hoyt. The name struck like a slow echo, not loud, just deep. He walked over to a patch of shade, sat down against the stone wall, and pulled out his phone. Opened the notes he kept buried in his files. His father's unit. Kunar Province. Year 2013. Rescue timeline unconfirmed. Survivors. Classified. His father's name had been among them. Mason closed his eyes. The man he'd humiliated, dismissed, soaked with water in front of a field full of strangers, had once flown into fire to save his father, and never told a soul. He sat there a long time. No tears, no apologies, just the slow, sinking truth that sometimes the loudest lessons come in silence, and the men who change your life don't need to speak to do it. 1 week later, the morning at Arlington felt the same. The breeze moved slow. Flags rippled without urgency. Visitors arrived in quiet pairs. Families walked the rows in reverence, and the weight of history settled gently over the stone. But something had changed. At the western gate, just to the right of the checkpoint, a new plaque had been installed. It wasn't large, no gold trim, no carved insignia, just brushed steel mounted on the stone wall at waist height. The kind of thing you might overlook if you weren't looking close enough. There was no title, no rank, no dedication, just one line, etched with deliberate strokes, each letter slightly imperfect, like it had been carved by hand, not machine. To those who came without title but left with legacy, visitors paused, not all, just the ones who understood. A retired nurse stood there for a while, arms crossed loosely, reading it over and over like a hymn. A young cadet took a photo and didn't post it. A little boy asked his mother what it meant, and she just knelt beside him and whispered, he showed up. Beneath the plaque, near the stone base of the wall, someone had left a notebook. Worn soft at the edges, with corners curled from time and use. It wasn't labeled, no elastic band, no cover design, just paper held together by memory. A guard noticed it first and stepped forward, expecting to collect it as lost property. But when he flipped open the cover, he stopped. Inside were drawings, sketches of the ceremony, charcoal and ink, the rows of chairs, the flags in motion, the figures of those who stood without knowing why. One page showed General Eastman at the podium, hand raised in salute. Another, Ford seated in the front row, head slightly bowed. Each image captured not perfection but feeling, posture, weight, presence. On the first page, at the top margin, a single line of handwriting sat alone. Memory doesn't need a lens, just someone who keeps their word. At the bottom, two initials. HF. The guard didn't take the notebook. He left it where it was. By noon, a small group had gathered at the plaque. No speeches, no photos, just heads bowed, stories exchanged in murmurs. Some had served, some had lost, some had simply heard. And near the end of the day, when the sun had lowered just enough to cast long shadows between the stones, Mason returned. He didn't wear a uniform this time, just jeans, a jacket, and a quiet step. He stood before the plaque for a long while, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo, the one from the bag, the one with his father in it, smiling next to a man no one recognized at the time. He didn't tape it to the wall. He didn't leave it there. He folded it gently, slipped it back into his coat, and whispered something only he could hear. Then he turned and walked the rows, not with guilt, but with understanding. Because legacy isn't about who stands at the front, it's about who stays when no one's looking. And sometimes, the loudest echoes come from the quietest footsteps. That day, at the gate, no one saw Harrison Ford arrive. And no one saw him leave. But he had been there, and now so had everyone else. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.